Yo, 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 what's up, what's up? Nah, just messing with you. It's Miss Paps. We are looking at Hamlet. We're up to Act 3, Scene 1. We've just finished Act 2, where Hamlet has asked the players to perform and has ended with the soliloquy, where he basically says that he's going to use the performance of that play to prove that Claudius is guilty so that he can carry out his revenge. So this act takes place the next day, so the day when the play is going to be performed. So we're in the castle and we have Claudius, Gertrude, Polonius, Ophelia, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern come in. The king starts off halfway through a conversation, so this scene happens in media res, in the middle of the action, which is just a nice fast way for Shakespeare to get to the point. So Claudius basically says, have you found out why Hamlet's acting so mad? And Rosencrantz says, nah, he won't tell us why. And Guildenstern says, in fact, he changes the topic every time we ask him what's going on. And Gertrude says, did he receive you well? So was he polite to you? Was he nice? And Rosencrantz says, yeah, like a gentleman. But Guildenstern adds on, with much forcing of his disposition, so he's behaved a little bit weirdly. And Rosencrantz adds on that, yes, he's happy to talk to us, but he's not interested in having a proper conversation. And Gertrude says, did you convince him to actually do anything instead of moping around all the time? And Rosencrantz says, yes, he was really pleased to hear that there were actors coming to town. And he's actually going to watch a play with them tonight. And Polonius intervenes here and says, yes, he beseeched me to entreat your majesties to hear and see the matter. So he says, Hamlet wants you guys to come and watch the play with him. And Claudius says, with all my heart, it doth much content me to hear him so inclined. So yeah, I'm really glad he's showing such interest. Then he says, good gentleman, give him a further edge and drive his purpose on to these delights. So yeah, keep encouraging Hamlet, let him keep having fun so that he cheers up and everything's better. And Rosencrantz says, sure. So then they leave. And Claudius says to Gertrude, sweet Gertrude, leave us too, for we have closely sent for Hamlet hither, that he, as it were by accident, may here affront Ophelia. So he's referring back to the plan that Polonius came up with in the last act, where he and Polonius are going to spy on Hamlet while he talks to Ophelia to see if they're mad with love. So here he just says, go away, Gertrude, we're going to spy on Hamlet when Ophelia comes by to see if he's mad from love. And Gertrude then says, yes, I shall obey you. And then she turns and says to Ophelia, for your part, Ophelia, I do wish that your good beauties be the happy cause of Hamlet's wildness, so I hope that he has gone mad from love. So shall I hope your virtues will bring him to his wonted way again to both your honours. So she's saying, I hope that love is the cause of Hamlet's madness, because then he can easily be cured by marrying Ophelia. And Ophelia says, yes, I hope so. Then Polonius basically says, Ophelia, you go and walk over there. Claudius, we're going to hide ourselves here. And he asks Ophelia to read a book. That show of such an exercise may colour your loneliness. So he's saying, read this book so that Hamlet doesn't think it's suspicious that you're walking around on your own. And then he says something fairly ambiguous. He says, we are oft to blame in this, 'tis too much proved, that with devotion's visage and pious action we do sugar over the devil himself. So devotion's visage just means face. So with the face of devotion and with pious action, we hide the devil. We create a mask for the devil. So he's just saying that evil is often hidden by the appearance of piousness and devotion. So with this, it's an ambiguous phrase because he could potentially be explicitly referring to two things. Firstly, he could be saying that Ophelia is hiding her actions by pretending to read a book. So she's pretending to be, devoted and pious by reading, but really she's just waiting for Hamlet. But that seems fairly unlikely because it would mean that he's calling Ophelia an act of spying the devil himself. So it seems unlikely that he would say that. What's more likely is that he's actually referring to Hamlet's madness, that he's saying that his belief that Hamlet has been mad from love is devotion's visage, but really he's mad because the devil has infected him. So he's potentially saying here that he's worried that really Hamlet is actually mad and that it's the devil's intervention. However, this is quite a serious thing to say because, of course, it can also be applied to Claudius, that he appears to be a good king and a nice person, but really he is quite evil. And so Claudius reacts to that here when he has his aside. And this is a really significant aside for us because up until this point, we have never once had Claudius say or do anything to indicate his true personality. So up until this point, Claudius has come across as a caring and loving stepfather to Hamlet, and as a very efficient and capable king. He seemed to be genuinely upset about his brother's death. But now he says in an aside, "Oh, 'tis too true, how smart a lash that speech doth give my conscience." So he's saying that's, been like a whack across my back. It makes me feel really guilty. And then he says, "The harlot's cheek, beautied with plastering art, is not more ugly to the thing that helps it than is my deed to my most painted word." So he compares his deceit to makeup. He's basically saying that, like a prostitute who wears makeup in order to pretend to be beautiful and thereby get custom, he uses his words to hide his deeds in order to make people continue to like him. So this is tying in really nicely with that theme of false appearances because it's showing us that he has the appearance of being honest when he's not. Then Polonius says that he can hear Hamlet coming, so that Claudius and Polonius hide and Hamlet comes in. Now here we have the most famous soliloquy from the entire play. Again, we'll be studying it in really close detail in class, so don't worry too much if you don't pick up any techniques or anything, but let's just go through it and make sure we understand what Hamlet is saying. Now, it's really important that you understand that this soliloquy is frequently attributed to being about suicide. It's not. It's very clearly not about suicide. He is talking about death. He is talking about the consequences of the afterlife, but he's not actually talking about suicide. He's not saying that suicide is a good thing. So he says, "To be or not to be, that is the question." So that's similar to in his first soliloquy when he wants his flesh to melt. He just wants to not exist anymore. But then he says, "Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them." So this is a question of fate and predestination. If fortune has given you something terrible to deal with, he's saying, well, do we just give in and let fortune deal us a bad hand, or do we fight against our fortune and our fate? Do we try and solve it? So the question that he's asking here is it better to put up with misfortune and live miserably, so that's suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? Or should he be trying to fight against his fate and his fortune and die in the struggle, which is to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them? So we know that Hamlet sees his fate as being to put right the wrongs that are afflicting Elsinore. So he said in Act 1 that the time is out of joint, "O cursed spite that ever I was born to put it right." So we know that he does see his duty as being fixing these problems. So then he says, he kind of goes on a little digression here. So he said that he could take arms against his troubles and then as a result die. And then he says, to die is like to sleep. To sleep, there's no more problems. And by sleep, to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. So he's saying death is like sleep and it ends all of life's problems. So it's something that's really good and that everyone wants to happen. And then he says, to die to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. So he says, when we sleep, we dream, and what sort of dreams would you have in death? So when he's talking about dreams in death, obviously he's talking about the concept of an afterlife. So he's talking about whether he'd go to heaven or whether he'd go to hell or whether he'd suffer in purgatory like his father's ghost. So he says, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. So the afterlife that you might go to makes you pause and fear for the consequences of your actions. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. So this is the thing that makes life such a misery, because every time we make a decision, we need to think about the long-term consequences. We need to think about whether we're going to heaven or to hell. So we can see that revenge, in this case for him, he's having trouble acting out his revenge because he's worried about the morality of it. He's worried about whether he's going to go to heaven or to hell when he dies as a result of enacting this revenge. So we can see that he is really overthinking this, but it's at a very philosophical, deep level, not simply a level of being scared that it's going to be difficult or anything. And then he gets a little bit retrospective and he gives us accumulation of the problems that men often experience. So he says, who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes. So he's saying, why would anyone put up with this list of terrible things that can happen and that frequently happen? And then he says, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. So he's saying, why would anyone put up with how miserable life is and all the problems that might come up in life when you could end it easily just with a sword, with a knife? And then he says, who would fardels bear? Fardels being like peasants, labourers. And he says, why would these people bear grunting and sweating under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of. So he's saying basically here that the reason why people who have miserable lives don't commit suicide is because we don't know what that might lead to after death. We don't know where we're going, and it's better to deal with the problems that you currently have than risk taking on worse problems after life. So then he says, thus conscience does make cowards of us all. So thus, thinking about what's right and what's wrong makes us cowards because we can't act because we're terrified to act, because if we act and it turns out to be wrong, then we're going to go to hell forever and it's going to have a huge consequence in our eternal life. So you can see he's thinking really deeply about the consequences of revenge. He's thinking really deeply about morality and really deeply about whether it's worth fighting against fate. He considers taking revenge to be his fate, but he's worried that if he does that, he's going to go to hell. So it's quite an interesting dilemma for him to be in, and quite a Renaissance dilemma as opposed to the medieval structures that people like Laertes and Pyrrhus would have been really focusing on. And then he says, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought. So he's saying, thus, when you initially really want to do something, you overthink it and then you can't act, you're frozen. And enterprises of great pith and moment, with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. So he's saying, and thus, thinking about consequences makes it impossible to act, and lots of great things that could have happened over the course of history have never happened because people have been too scared to act because they're worried about the consequences. Then he sees Ophelia. So he says, soft you now, as in he's telling himself to shut up because he doesn't want Ophelia to overhear him. And he says, the fair Ophelia. And then he addresses Ophelia and he says, nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. So he just says, in your eyes I remember all my sins. Ophelia says, hi, how are you? Hamlet says, I'm well. Ophelia says, I have these letters that you wrote me and I want to give them back to you. And Hamlet says,